Hostage negotiations between Israel and Hamas have reached a stalemate. Each side is blaming the other one for being too rigid. Fighting has intensified over the last week throughout the Gaza Strip. Firebelt bombings were reported in northern Gaza after the Al-Qassam brigades carried out 2 elaborate ambushes targeting IDF soldiers. Meanwhile, Israel has published plans to mobilize and concentrate the entire population of Gaza in a designated humanitarian city that will be established on the ruins of Rafah, triggering international and local condemnations. I'm Alon Burstein. Let's dive in. On Saturday, July 12th, Israel and Hamas both reported a seeming stalemate in the hostage and truce negotiations. The sides began 8 rounds of negotiations at the beginning of the week in Qatar, and this was done in parallel to the visit of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and his negotiations with U.S. President Trump in Washington, D.C. Now, over the past week, there have been multiple leaks and reports about the ongoing talks and where things may have gotten stuck. What I'm going to try to do is make sense out of what the sides have been negotiating and where things may be stalled, but I emphasize that this is pieced together from Israeli, Palestinian, regional and international reports and leaks. Some of these also contradict each other. Before I continue, I'm going to ask anyone who's watching to hit that subscribe button if you follow the contents of this channel closely. That way you can stay up to date on all the latest updates in the Israel-Hamas War, and I will also know how many people are following. The deal that is being negotiated between the sides relates to 5 broad elements, 4 of which have aspects that the sides disagree upon and were supposed to be negotiating over the past week. While at the beginning of the week, both the negotiating countries as well as Israel and Hamas were all expressing optimism that these 4 issues can be resolved, by the end of the week, all the sides are speaking much more pessimistically, and there are even rumors that the negotiations may be collapsing. So, what are the 5 elements, and where do things stand? Starting with the truce between the sides, the deal focuses on a 60-day truce, during which time there will be a complete cessation of any violent actions that are taken by either side. It's important to note that this binds not only Israel and Hamas, but also the other Palestinian militant organizations in Gaza. In addition to the cessation of violent activities, Gaza will also be declared a no-fly zone for the Israeli military for at least 10 hours per day during each of those 60 days. It's important to note this is the only facet that the sides have come to an agreement about before the negotiations started, so this was not the focus of the talks during the past week. With regards to the points of disagreement between the sides, while most people around the world tend to be focused either on the hostage release or on the talks of a final ceasefire and an end to the war between the sides, the main hurdles during the past week actually relate to the other 2 elements that were being discussed, that is the entrance of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip and the IDF redeployment in Gaza during those 60 days. With regards to the IDF redeployment in Gaza, entering into the negotiations, Hamas demanded that the IDF carry out a complete withdrawal of its forces back to the positions that the military held on March 18th, that is before the collapse of the previous ceasefire. Israel in turn insisted on holding most of the positions that it has taken up since the return to fighting, and particularly maintaining the Morag corridor, that is the access that the IDF maintains running roughly here between Han Yunis and Rafah, severing Rafah from the rest of the Gaza Strip. This disagreement became a major source of controversy between the sides over the past week, and it is now being reported as one of the main facets that is threatening the negotiations. After an initial Israeli refusal to negotiate its positions along that Morag corridor, Israel's Channel 12 news site reported on July 9th that Qatari delegates warned Israel that negotiations would collapse if the country does not show more flexibility. Later in the day, it was reported that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu asked the Israeli military to develop a more southern access line that the military could quote-unquote live with, and that Israel was proposing a partial withdrawal from that Morag corridor, but conditioning this on the fact that Israel will be allowed to patrol the area that it withdraws with drones in the skies of Gaza. According to a report in the BBC, Hamas agreed to negotiate this as well as Israel's positions around the perimeter that surrounds the Gaza Strip that Israel has created since the war began, but it demanded that Israel present maps of its redeployment. Al Jazeera then published leaks of the maps that Israel proposed on July 11th, which, according to reports, completely enraged Hamas and have led the negotiations to be on the brink of collapsing. According to the map, and again this is the leak from Al Jazeera, Israel is proposing that the IDF will maintain its positions in an expanded perimeter surrounding the Gaza Strip, extending in some cases to up to 3 kilometers into the Gaza Strip. This comes in contradiction to the initial talks between the sides that Israel would only maintain up to 1.5 kilometers of that perimeter. The map also shows that the IDF will maintain its positions either along the Morag corridor or in parallel to the corridor, very, very close to it, but a little bit south, still severing Rafah from the rest of the Gaza Strip. After Hamas's initial rejection of these maps, Israel is now reportedly being pressured into presenting an updated redeployment map. However, at this stage, this facet is also being described as one of the main aspects that is leading to the stalemate. With regards to the second facet, the entrance of humanitarian aid, this has also been a major bone of contention between the sides, and is also being described as one of the things that might derail the negotiations. Both sides agree that there will be a substantial increase in the entrance of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip during the truce. However, the disagreement relates to the mechanism of the distribution of that humanitarian aid. Hamas is demanding that the distribution of that humanitarian aid go through the previous channels of the United Nations, their agencies, and their routes in the Gaza Strip, which on the one hand is a mechanism that allows the humanitarian aid to be delivered to different areas in the Gaza Strip, to specifically the towns and villages, but also makes it a lot easier for Hamas to take over large parts of the aid, something that Israel has complained about since the war began. Israel, in turn, is demanding that the aid be distributed solely through the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, that is the new mechanism that is operating stationary distribution sites in the Gaza Strip since the end of May. This mechanism of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has made it much more difficult for Hamas to take over the aid, but it has also been criticized as vastly limiting the access of Palestinians to food distribution, since only those who can reach those stationary sites can have access to food. It has also led to hundreds of Palestinian deaths in violence that has broken out around those distribution sites. Throughout the past week, despite the fact that this has been a main element in the negotiations, there were little to no advances that were reported in bringing the sides closer together on agreeing on the distribution mechanism. The only breakthrough that was reported was on July 8th, when there was a report that Qatar had put forth a proposal that the United Nations and other unaffiliated agencies would be responsible for the distribution of humanitarian aid in the areas of Gaza where the IDF withdraws from, and in turn in the areas of Gaza that the IDF still controls, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation will be the only one that distributes humanitarian aid. While some reports suggested that Israel might be leaning towards accepting this, there were no reports that Israel actually accepted this, and also there were no reports about what Hamas thinks of this proposal. By July 9th, the Saudi Asharak reported that the disagreement over humanitarian aid is another one of the elements that is threatening to collapse the negotiations. The final two elements, the release of the Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners, and the discussions regarding a permanent ceasefire and an end to the war, appear to have not been the main focus of this week's negotiations. Nonetheless, it's important to remember that these have been the main sources of disagreement in past rounds of negotiations, and thus, if and when the focus does shift to them, they are also likely to lead to, I will say at least major complications that the sides will have to overcome. Regarding the release of hostages and Palestinian prisoners, both Israel and Hamas have agreed that the deal will include the release of 10 live Israeli hostages and the return of the bodies of 18 hostages in exchange for the release of Palestinian prisoners. And Israel has also accepted Hamas's demand that the hostages will be released in stages throughout the 60 days. Israel initially demanded that all the hostages be released by day 7. This led negotiations to break down at the beginning of June. Now Israel is accepting Hamas's demands. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu also stated on July 11th that Hamas will be the one to determine which Israeli hostages are released and in what order, indicating that also on this issue, Israel has accepted Hamas's terms to be the one to decide which hostages are released. What the sides have seemingly yet to negotiate are the questions regarding the Palestinian prisoners, that relates also to how many prisoners will be released in exchange for each Israeli hostage, and also who will those Palestinian prisoners be. While this may appear to be a more technical detail, it is important to note that Hamas has in the past stated that it will demand the release of the most high-profile Palestinian prisoners, among others Marwan Barghouti and Ahmed Sadat, and Israel in turn has stated that it will veto the release of these prisoners. So while at this point this is not the focus of negotiations, it may become a very important facet that will be negotiated if the other elements are overcome. The final element relates to the negotiations over the final ceasefire and the end to the war. This This has been the continuous sticking point in previous rounds of negotiations, often leading to their complete collapse. Israel has consistently demanded that any deal be limited to a specific time period after which fighting can resume, while Hamas has demanded that any deal be worded such that the truce will automatically be extended until a ceasefire is reached, i.e., once the truce commences, there will be no more return to fighting, the sides will continue to negotiate until a ceasefire is reached. Hamas has also demanded the United States specifically guarantee this aspect of the deal. Over the past week, there were several leaks about advances that might have been made with regards to this wording of if the truce will be extended beyond the 60 days as long as negotiations continue. A possible proposed wording about a U.S. guarantee was published on July 4th, and by July 9th, Sky News reported that Bishara Bahbah, who is Steve Witkoff's emissary to talks with Hamas, conveyed to Hamas President Trump's personal guarantee that fighting will not resume after the 60-day truce. So, on the one hand, it appears that there are advances in that direction. On the other hand, on July 10th, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu met with the family members of hostages that are held in Gaza, and this happened specifically after his meetings with U.S. President Trump. And in that meeting, he stated, among others, that there will be a return to fighting after the 60-day truce in Gaza unless Hamas accepts all of Israel's terms, which include the movement's complete disarming, Gaza being demilitarized, and Hamas having no more governing capabilities in the Gaza Strip. So again, at this point, the sides are not discussing this as one of the main reasons for negotiations being stalled, but it is very possible that if the other elements are resolved, the exact wording of how the truce might be extended and can fighting be resumed will again lead to further complications. So, just to summarize about the ongoing negotiations, where do things stand right now? Despite the repeated statements about stalemates and possible collapse of the talks, the teams still remain in Qatar, and negotiations are still ongoing. The next reported phase is going to be Israel possibly presenting alternative maps with regards to the redeployment of the IDF in the Gaza Strip during the truce, and possibly, if this will be accepted, this may blow new winds into the sails of advancing negotiations on the other elements as well. On the other hand, it is also very possible that negotiations will fizzle out now that the meetings between Netanyahu and Trump have ended and the pressure on Israel and possibly the indirect pressure on Hamas is going to die out. Again, that is speculation on my part. At this point, the sides are reporting a stalemate and that negotiations may collapse. However, the teams are still negotiating. Obviously, it remains to be seen. I'll report more as things develop. Turning from the negotiations to the ongoing fighting in the Gaza Strip, over the past week there were substantial escalations in the fighting between the sides, with some analysts suggesting this is associated with each side trying to get in its quote-unquote last punches before a truce is declared. In the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, the IDF reported substantial fighting taking place in the areas of Darj Tufah and Beit Hanun on July 6th and on July 7th, and the Al-Qassam brigades reported intensive fighting that happened in the areas of Zaytun on July 6th. That is all in the areas in and around Gaza City, in these areas over here. Then on July 8th, the Al-Qassam brigades carried out an unusual, elaborate ambush in the areas of Beit Hanun, targeting an IDF patrol in that region. According to reports, an array of 2 to 3 hidden explosive devices were detonated when an IDF unit arrived on an access road that, I will say in a caveat, the IDF had controlled. Nonetheless, Hamas operatives managed to plant explosives only in the previous day. And when that IDF patrol arrived, those detonations went off, injuring several soldiers. Then, when rescue forces arrived, the Al-Qassam operatives launched a second attack using snipers and an array of gunfire, leading to a major battle. The Israeli Air Force reportedly responded with massive attacks in the area as well in order to stop the possible kidnapping of any IDF soldiers that have been killed or that were engaged in the battle. By the day's end, the IDF reported that in that confrontation, 5 IDF soldiers were killed and 14 were injured as a result of that Al-Qassam ambush, and Palestinian sources reported that 78 Palestinians were killed in those Air Force attacks. And the following day, the IDF launched a major operation focused in that area where the ambush was launched, in the areas of Beit Hanun, with intensive firebelt bombings being reported throughout the day. The military reported increasing fighting in the area also on July 10th, and the Al-Qassam brigades also reported targeting IDF forces again in the areas of Darj Tufah, that is all in the northern parts of the Gaza city, on July 12th. Meanwhile, in the central parts of the Gaza Strip, a major IDF airstrike was reported on July 10th, reportedly hitting the entrance of an international clinic in the areas of Deir el-Balah, that is the central city in the Gaza Strip, right around here. According to Palestinian sources, the attack targeted Palestinians who were waiting in line to receive nutrition supplements for children. 15 people were reportedly killed in that attack, including 7 children under the age of 11 and 3 women. The IDF reported that the airstrike targeted a Hamas Nukhba operative who had participated in the October 7th attack. The military also added that it is investigating allegations of uninvolved civilians that may have been killed in that attack. Meanwhile, throughout the week, there were similar increases in fighting that were reported in the southern parts of the Gaza Strip. On July 6th, the IDF reported unusual activity that the military carried out in the Janina area of Rafah, that is this area down here that the IDF is already in control of in the last several months, reportedly uncovering and destroying tunnel arrays in that area. On July 9th, Hamas carried out another unusual ambush in the area of Han Yunis. This time, Al-Qassam operatives reportedly emerged from a tunnel and attempted to kidnap an IDF reserve soldier who was operating a bulldozer in that region. According to both the IDF and the Al-Qassam brigades, the soldier was killed by the attackers after a struggle when he was trying to prevent his own kidnapping, and this also led to an intensive gun battle with other IDF forces in that area. In addition to this, on July 10th, Palestinian sources reported unusual IDF activity reaching the outskirts of the humanitarian zone in the Al-Mawasi camp in Han Yunis. That is, the Al-Mawasi camp is the humanitarian region over here, most western side of Han Yunis, and again, according to Palestinian sources, the IDF tanks had reached that area. Reports stated that these were accompanied by bulldozers and helicopters. This led to a lot of rumors spreading that the IDF is expanding its activity into that region. In addition to all of these, rockets were also fired from the Gaza Strip throughout the week. Some of these targeted the Israeli kibbutz Nirim that is in the area surrounding the Gaza Strip, right around here. According to reports, some of those rockets managed to hit the areas in the kibbutz where construction had recently begun to rebuild the homes that were destroyed during the October 7th attack. In total, the IDF reported that throughout the last week, 7 IDF soldiers were killed in the Gaza Strip, bringing the total number of IDF soldiers killed in the Gaza Strip since the invasion of the Strip began to 446, with 2,792 soldiers reportedly injured. In turn, the Palestinian Health Ministry in the Gaza Strip reported that 484 Palestinians were killed in the Gaza Strip over the past week, bringing the total number of Palestinians killed in the Gaza Strip since the war began to 57,822, and 138,095 Palestinians reportedly injured in the Gaza Strip since the war began. I remind everyone that the Palestinian Health Ministry in the Gaza Strip does not distinguish between militants and civilians. It simply reports how many bodies have been accounted for in the Gaza Strip since the war began. I will say that today, July 12th, both the IDF and the Palestinian Health Ministry published information regarding deaths that have occurred since the return to fighting on March 18th. The Palestinian Health Ministry in the Gaza Strip reported that since that return to fighting, 7,311 Palestinians have been killed in the Gaza Strip, and the IDF in turn reported that 1,300 Palestinian militants have been killed in the Gaza Strip since that return to fighting on March 18th. So possibly the numbers, at least of the last several months, are 1,300 militants out of 7,311 Palestinians being killed. But again, that's speculation on my part. I'm simply reporting the numbers that are being reported from both sides. Before I conclude, there are 2 more topics that I'm going to point out as noteworthy from the past week that may have larger implications with regards to the Israel-Hamas War. The first is what's going on in the West Bank. While each week there are continuous IDF operations throughout the West Bank and violence between the Israeli settlers and Palestinians, this week saw a particular spike in some of those events. On July 9th, it was reported that Palestinians threw stones and torched cars near the Bat Ain settlement. This happened in the vicinity of the Tzurif village, leading to an IDF operation in that village and 2 Palestinians being arrested. 3 days later, on July 12th, Israeli settlers reportedly raided the village, and there were reports of fields being torched and confrontations that were erupting. The IDF and police units responded and dispersed the incident. No arrests were made. On July 10th, a combined Palestinian attack took place in the Gush Etzion junction when 2 attackers, who I'll say were reportedly members of the Palestinian Authority police, carried out both a stabbing and a shooting attack. 1 Israeli was killed in that attack, and both attackers were also killed. On that same day, an IDF soldier was stabbed by Palestinians during an activity that the IDF was carrying out in the Roma village. The soldier was injured, and the attacker was also shot and killed. The escalations continued, and on July 11th, 2 Palestinians were killed in an Israeli settler attack that took place near the village of Sanjil. One of those, Saif ad-Din Muslat, was a Palestinian U.S. citizen, and he was reportedly beaten to death by a group of settlers who raided the area. A second Palestinian was also found dead on the scene later on, reportedly shot in the back. Palestinian sources stated that Palestinians were attempting to get to their lands at the edge of the village, which is near a settler outpost, and then they were attacked by the mob. Israeli settlers in turn reported that Palestinians attacked the settlers in the region, leading to a brawl that developed. The IDF put out 2 different statements about this. The first stated that Palestinian terror operatives threw stones at Israeli settlers, injuring a few of them, and a brawl then developed that included attacks against Palestinians. The second statement was issued several hours later, stating that the reports are being investigated about Palestinians who were killed during the violence that erupted. Again, cycles of violence are not uncommon in the West Bank, but the pace and escalation of the violence, and I'll say particularly amidst a very sensitive time with regards to hostage negotiations, makes this noteworthy, as it could have much larger repercussions to these ongoing events. The second thing that I'm going to relate to relates to a plan that was revealed by Israel's Defense Minister Israel Katz on July 7th. Speaking to reporters, Katz stated that Israel is planning the construction of what he called a quote-unquote humanitarian city that would be built on the ruins of Rafah in the Gaza Strip in order to gradually mobilize and concentrate the entire Palestinian population in Gaza in this area. According to Katz, the plan will begin with relocating some 600,000 Palestinians from the Mawasi region in the area, and they will go through IDF checkpoints on arrival and then will not be permitted to leave that area that again will be in the southern parts of the Gaza Strip in Rafah over here. The Israeli Defense Minister stated that the IDF will not govern the area, but it will secure it from afar, with the aim being to separate the Palestinian civilian population from Hamas's control, creating a physical barrier where Hamas cannot rebuild and the population cannot reintegrate with Hamas's governing mechanism. On the following day, it was reported that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu is in favor of what he had termed Katz's plan, and by July 12th, there were already increasing reports that the initiative is already in advanced planning stages. Looking at this more broadly, even though at this point this is just a plan on paper, it is worth taking note of, I would say, for several reasons. First, the IDF has stated that it is currently in the final stages of what it is called Operation Gideon's Chariots in the Gaza Strip, and while the IDF Chief of Staff Zamir stated that the military does not plan to forcibly relocate the Palestinian population, one of the 6 aims of the operation that was approved by Israel on May 7th is explicitly to centralize and move the population. So it's worth noting that while officially that is part of the aims, the Chief of Staff said that it's not part of the aims, but now this plan is being presented. Second, it is also important to note these potential plans within the context of the ongoing negotiations about an IDF redeployment in the Gaza Strip during the truce. Israel's Defense Minister Katz explicitly stated that if it is possible, Israel will use the 60-day truce in order to begin construction of the quote-unquote humanitarian city on the ruins of Rafah, and this may be indicative about the pressure that both sides are mounting with regards to that Morag corridor and specifically the IDF redeployment and control of the areas of Rafah. Third, it is also important to take note of this plan in the context of Israel's international court cases, specifically the injunctions that were imposed by the International Court of Justice with regards to the charges that Israel is facing on the charge of genocide. On July 11th, a group of 16 Israeli scholars of international law sent a letter to Israel's Defense Minister Katz, Chief of Staff Zamir, as well as others within the Israeli military and political arena, stating that this plan to forcibly concentrate a group in a particular area where they cannot leave would constitute both war crimes, crimes against humanity, and that under certain conditions it could also be considered genocide if this creates the conditions that lead to death of a substantial amount of the population. The authors of that letter also urged the leadership to abandon the plan, and they made explicit reference to Israel's court cases in the international court system, saying that Israel is facing charges of genocide and is defending itself, and this plan is, to put it lightly, not going to contribute to Israel's defense. Those are my highlights on the latest developments in the last week in the Israel-Hamas War. If you find these reports informative, please do remember to hit that like button, subscribe, turn on notifications, send them on to anyone you think might be interested in the war. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I'm Alon Burstein. I'm a visiting assistant professor and Israel Institute fellow in the Department of Political Science at Tufts University. Thanks for watching.